Welcome back. Our lecture topic now is learning and memory. One of the most prominent ways that marketers attempt to manipulate how we interpret product information is through learning. We're also going to look at memory because what good is learning if you don't recall what you've learned, right? Do you remember your three major types of learning through Psych 101 or introductory psychology? Remember first that the word conditioning means what in psychology? It means learning. So when we say classical conditioning, we're talking about a form of learning, right? Classical learning. Classical conditioning is learning through trigger association. Trigger association. Remember, operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement and punishment. Now, some of you might have learned that classical conditioning is learning through association without that word trigger. I really encourage you to include that word trigger in your memory because it really helps so that you will not be confused when you're trying to determine between the two in examples, because trigger means that something is happening before the response, right? Where with operant conditioning, reinforcement and punishment, that's happening after the response. So classical conditioning is learning through trigger association. And then our third type of learning is observational learning, sometimes also known as vicarious learning. And that is learning through modeling. In particular, it's learning through watching a model. So each of these forms of learning have several interesting applications to the study of consumer issues. And we're going to start by reviewing each of them rather quickly since you've already had them, right? And then learning more about each during the process of exploring consumer issues and applications. So we're going to start here with classical conditioning. And remember Pavlov's dogs? Does that ring a bell? If you didn't get that joke, maybe you need a quick review, right? Remember that at feeding time, as soon as the dogs smelled the food, they would bark, jump up and down, wag their tails, climb on the walls, and especially they would salivate. And actually, it was the salivation response that is the one that Pavlov focused on in his lab, right? When Pavlov began ringing a bell prior to the feeding, just prior to it, the dogs eventually began responding to the bell the same way that they did to the food. In this case, salivating, that's what he looked at. They had learned to associate the bell with the food, learning by trigger association, the trigger because the bell comes first. Now, some of the terminology we want to quickly review here. The unconditioned stimulus is the unlearned one. Again, remember what conditioning means. That will really help you remember these terms. So the unconditioned stimulus is the unlearned stimulus, something that is responded to right from birth. It doesn't need learning. In our example, Pavlov's dogs, what is the unconditioned stimulus? It is the food. Now, the unconditioned response is the unlearned response, right? The unlearned response to the unconditioned stimulus. Again, a response that is made from birth that doesn't require learning. In our example, Pavlov's dogs, what is the unconditioned response? Salivating to the food. We're going to say to the food because the unconditioned and the conditioned response are not always the same, but sometimes, in fact, quite often they are. And this is a way to be able to tell them apart, salivating to the food. Now, the conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that you learn, the one that is learned. It would not be responded to at birth. It would need to be learned. In our example, Pavlov's dogs, that would be what? The bell, right? And the conditioned response is a learned response to the conditioned stimulus. So in our example of Pavlov's dogs, what is the conditioned response? Salivating, keep going, to the bell, right? Salivating to the bell. So now let's practice. Let's see if you can identify the four terms in this example. McDonald's repeatedly associates its golden arches with its food products. Now, when consumers see the arches, they salivate. You probably don't notice it because, unlike babies or dogs, you've been trained to swallow, right? But this does happen. So, in this example, I want you to pause the video, identify the four terms on the bottom: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. Then start the video again to see if you got them right. So the unconditioned stimulus here is food. The unconditioned response is salivating to the food. The conditioned stimulus is arches, and the conditioned response, salivating to the arches.